getting your cybersecurity program funded lessons in telling compelling stories that drive business decision making. So let's move. Unfortunately, you can't see my slides, which is really unfortunate. But so by the end of the session, you will be able to, one, understand why cybersecurity programs are typically underfunded or unfunded. Two, learn what drives business decision makers. What are the drivers that actually move business decision makers to fund programs like cybersecurity? And three, gain skills in effectively communicating with business decision makers in ways that drive them to action. So if I can move this along. So who am I? So my name is Rhea Naidoo. I am currently a leadership coach and podcaster. I am a cybersecurity, in my past life, I was a cybersecurity automation co-founder. I also was at McKinsey & Company for about 5 years, where I focused on cybersecurity. And you might ask, why is McKinsey & Company doing cybersecurity? And that would be a really, really good question. It turns out that a lot of cybersecurity leaders require help in translating what they need and what they want to do into terms the business can understand. So I was mostly engaged in helping do exactly this, helping cybersecurity organizations figure out what it is that they really need to do, and helping them drive that message home with their business stakeholders that are really holding the purse strings, that are really driving real change. So I think that the cybersecurity organization can do as much as it can from a technical standpoint, but without the business's support, and we'll dive into that more, a lot we cannot really move forward the way that we want to move forward. I have also been in the shoes of an executive at that level. So I was at Nike for a while, where I drove organizational transformation, leadership development for a large technology organization. So I've been in the throes of going and requesting funding for things, sort of having to lobby the sort of highly political landscape that is an organization to drive funding and to get the funding that I required at the time to just do my job and execute the programs and the strategy that I had been tasked with. So I'm going to be sharing some of that insight today. I also am launching a podcast called Enormous Issues, Audacious Ideas. That's launching April 1st. So check that out. And my website is www.theartfulladder.com, which is my coaching website. Unfortunately, I'm just having to tell you all of this because I cannot share my screen, but let's just try and make this work. So what I've learned from working with CISOs is that most security teams are really frustrated and fighting fires. So what does this look like? So we did some research and we found that top quartile security teams spend on average 70% of their time on proactive security measures. So what are proactive security measures? Things like threat intelligence, things like hunting, things like incident response simulation. So things that and also just implementing new controls in the organization to stop security threats from happening, security events from happening. Whereas the average security team spends over 80% on reactive tasks. So what this means is that most security teams are running around, and you know this, I know this, we've all been in these shoes, with their hair on fire, trying to whack-a-mole and fight incident response. Whereas the top teams tend to spend less time on this. They have already gotten their controls in place and they spend more time on the proactive measures. And this causes a lot of frustration in the team, of course. And there's a good reason for this. So why do security teams spend so much time in that balance, shifting so much more towards reactive than proactive? It's not because the security team don't know what to do. It's also not because the security teams don't have the time to do it typically. It is very much funding related, that they do not get the funding to go and spend money on the security controls that they need to put in place. On the other hand, there's a secondary reason, and that is from a strategic standpoint. So CISOs turn over too fast. So the second reason is CISOs turn over too fast to be able to drive real change, transformational change. So chief information security officers turn over at a rate of between, on average, 18 and 24 months, with about a quarter, 24% of Fortune 500 chief information security officers lasting less than a year in their current role. It's less than 1 year. So between 1 and 2 years is the average. Now, how long do you think it takes? You can put in the chat as well. How long, thanks, Nicole, does it take on average to implement a technology strategy in an organization? As a new leader coming into a role, how long does it usually take to implement that technology strategy? Well, I can tell you from experience and working with a lot of executives on strategy and implementation of transformation, it is between 2.5 and 3 years to actually drive transformational change. And the reason for this is that, a new leader comes into the organization, they usually have, 100 days just to ramp up, to get to know what they're doing. And they might take another 3-ish months to develop a strategy and get the team around it. Now, that's all good and well, but you know that organizations usually work on an annual basis in terms of their funding requests, and their annual planning happens typically on an annual basis. So even if you start at the beginning of the year, you might have missed that annual financial planning session. You might not have the programs that you want to implement. So it might take you another 6 to 9 months so you might be a year into the role and haven't got a single cent to drive anything new that you want to drive based on your strategy and your experience and what you're bringing in to change the old state of the organization. So, you might be between 6 months and a year into the role before you get any funding. And then you start with the procurement process. So this might take months in some organizations. I'm always surprised at how long it takes to onboard a new security vendor or any vendor in the organization, any technology vendor, especially if it is a very major transformational type of thing. So that you might have months of procurement to select a vendor. You might have a POC within that or outside of that, and then you might only bring them on and then start deploying. And then we all know how long it takes to deploy tools. This could be, 2.5 to 3 years before you actually manage to drive real change in the organization. But with security leaders changing every 1 or 2 years, new security leader comes in, strategy changes, direction changes. So this 2.5 years to 3 years is assuming that the organization has been pointed and moving in a single direction for that entire time, which is not often the case. So we have the situation of, security teams frustrated, fighting fires the whole time, not getting their stuff funded. Security leaders turning over too fast to actually implement some of those controls that actually drive realistic change in terms of fighting those fires, or getting ahead of fighting those fires. So why don't we have a look at why CISOs leave? Well, we all know how rich this cybersecurity job market is. A lot of them leave for higher pay. About 38% of CISOs leave for higher pay. But the vast majority of CISOs don't leave for higher pay. They actually leave due to lack of support from the rest of the organization, lack of support from the business. So 62% of them leave for reasons that are spread almost equally between the culture. The organization's culture does not emphasize security. 2 is that they're not actively included in decision making. So they're a chief, but they're not really a chief in terms of having a seat at the table and driving business decisions and helping business leaders make those trade-off decisions around where they want to spend their focus. And the third reason is that they don't have the budget. So all those reasons I can sort of synthesize as they don't have the support from the organization to do the things that they want to do. So if I had to think about the single biggest problem facing cybersecurity organizations and organizations in total in terms of their threat, it is the fact that they don't support their chief information security officers in driving the things that they know that they need to change. So what is the problem exactly? So why is this the case? Why do business decision makers not give security leaders the support that they need? Well, 2 things. And this is from speaking to a lot of CEOs, CFOs, and other business leaders that are driving business decision makers. And they basically typically say 2 things. They either say the security organization continues to be seen as a blocker to the organization. For better or worse, this is just the perception, and we all know that perception is reality. And the second reason is that security leaders talk Martian to Venetians. So, Martian being from Mars, Venetians being from Venus, security leaders talk Martian to Venetians. We're going to dive into both of these. This is great. Thank you. And thanks everyone for sticking with this. I know this has been crazy. All right. Okay. So now you can see my pretty slides. Thank you so much, Lisa. Okay. So the security organization, so these are the two reasons. And I want to actually talk to you and show you in their words what some of these not security leaders, these business leaders are saying. So these are actual quotes that I have heard firsthand from CEOs, CFOs, and other decision makers from the business side, not the technology side. So the first one, security leaders don't understand that the business does not exist, that this business does not exist to comply with their demands. Security is important, but the primary goal of the business is to serve customers and create shareholder value. Security leaders just don't seem to get this. I know, women supporting other women, it's awesome. Security leaders just don't seem to get this. Okay. And the second thing that I've heard is, I don't want to invite the Chief Information Security Officer to the meetings anymore. He makes everyone feel uncomfortable and doesn't add much value to the conversation. So when I hear this, I mean, it's a little bit catty, of course, but what I really am hearing when I'm hearing this is there's a lack of empathy. There's a lack of understanding. There's a lack of empathy. And no matter how senior you are, and we'll talk about this in more detail, no matter how senior you are, you're still a human being. And you still want to be talked to like a human being. And you still want to have someone understand your needs, be able to come into your shoes and, sort of move forward together in the way that you need to move forward. If you are responsible for moving this organization forward, you need every leader in your organization to know this, to know what your job is as the leader of the organization, and actively be trying to support you in doing that. So we'll talk about ways of doing that as well. The second is security leaders talk Martians to Venetians. So these are the types of things that I've heard. So this was a CEO of a very large luxury retail organization. Is this a 1% risk or is it a 99% risk? If it were 1% risk, I will eat it gladly. If you tell me it's a 99% risk, I'll throw the kitchen sink at your program. If it's a 30% risk, now you've got my attention. So what are we hearing here? We're hearing, hey, so these are the terms that I am thinking in. These are the words these are the kinds of decisions and trade-offs that I am making. Help me make those decisions. Help me make sense of these things in sort of language and terms that I can understand. The second thing that we're hearing that I've heard is, if I have $100 million to spend this year on technology, do I spend it on risk reduction or customer acquisition? Do I spend it on modernization or cost reduction in my legacy? Or building, so do I spend on cost reduction in my legacy or building a new digital organization to stay relevant in a rapidly changing world? The data that I'm seeing is not helping me make this decision. So this is an executive basically saying, hey, these are the types of trade-off decisions I'm making. These are the types of things that I'm trying to balance in my job, in my universe, in my world. What you're sharing with me is completely unhelpful in helping me make those decisions. You're making me do a lot of work to translate very technical type language into threats and vulnerabilities and controls and these things. Okay, that sounds really scary, that sounds really important, but how does that actually help me make the decision that I need to make? So let's talk a minute about power and influence. So what is power? Power is the potential to influence behavior. And it is an interesting one because as the security organization is, and as security leaders, we don't typically have power from an authority standpoint. And so we believe that we cannot influence the organization, but power can be held. Anybody in the organization can have influence over decision making. And there are multiple tactics that you can use to influence others. So essentially, power is the potential to influence behavior of others. So there's a couple of myths that we often fall into, especially us from an engineering background. We believe that power and influence are inherently slimy, meaning, oh, this is something that this is not nice. We don't really want to think about power and influence. This is not something that is ethical or moral to think about or to use. The second thing that we think about is that rationality is the best form of influence. Rationality meaning, the data says this is the logical argument, given this massive swath of incidents that have happened in our field in this way, the only logical outcome is that we should be investing in this program. Total myth, does not work. I'll talk to you about that. We'll see some of the data behind that just now. The third one is power stems solely from one's position. You have authority because of a position that you have. Often not the case. And the fourth myth is involving others or showing vulnerability weakens your own position. So taking a consultative approach, using empathy, leaning in, asking questions, those are all sort of vulnerable spaces to be in some way, shape, or form. So these are myths, and I'll show you exactly why they're myths. And apologies for the eye chart. So consequences of influence tactics. And in this chart, I'm not seeing every single one of these, but yeah, I've lost the headings here, but that's okay. On the left-hand side, you see certain on the bottom of the screen, you see influencing tactics. Legitimizing, meaning this is my position of power. I have legitimate power. Coalition is, forming coalitions with people. Ingratiation, meaning I'm a nice person and I ingratiate myself to others. Personal appeal means I have a relationship with the person and I make a personal appeal. What you're not seeing here, this one here, is actually consultation, taking a consultative approach. And we'll look at what that means in a second. And inspirational appeal, inspiring someone to action. So if you look at the blue line, that indicates if I try this tactic, how much resistance will I typically receive? This chart is the wrong chart, sorry. And then the pink line is how much commitment will I achieve if I try this tactic. So you won't see the label here, but rational appeal, making a rational argument, is this one. More than double the time, so this is about 40%, 45%, more than double the time I will try a rational argument and I will get resistance versus commitment. Consultation, triple the amount of commitment than resistance. Inspiration is the highest. So we're going to really focus on these three. Amazing that having your position of power will only get you, will get you resistance about 40% of the time and get you commitment almost 0% of the time. You might get people going along just because they have to, compliance. You might get a compliance reaction, but you won't get real commitment. So let's talk about those top 3 influence tactics for security leaders. Number one, inspirational appeal. 90% commitment if you try inspirational appeal. Now, this is great, but it's really difficult for us as security leaders, and I'll tell you why. So inspiration is not ambulance chasing, and that's a lot of what we're trying to, that's the world that we live in, is the worst case scenario. It's risk mitigation. But if you can, and I have seen companies do this, if you can align outcomes, your outcomes with the security program, with the business goals, the goals of the business, you might be able to use inspirational appeal. You might inspire someone to action through aligning with the mission and the core business objectives of that financial year, of that phase in the strategy, etc. So if you can share how your program acquires customers, for example, how does your security program acquire customers? Is this a net gain for you? Is it something that you can advertise? Is the security feature of your product something that will help you acquire customers? And I have worked for a IT hardware manufacturer in the Bay Area where they actually were adding security features onto their product line to acquire customers because of the security consciousness of the customer base that they were selling to. And this is a B2B client. So it is not impossible. In fact, they were also taking that and saying that these are the innovative things that they were doing, and their shareholder value was even going up because they were showing innovation, first movement advantages in the business. So that was really inspirational. So yeah, how does your security product or program increase revenue, reduce costs, automation, for example? So it is not impossible, it's difficult, but it's not impossible. The second one is consultation, 55% commitment. So solve the problem the business cares about. So consultation means, I'm going and asking questions, I'm consulting, I'm trying to figure out what is important to you. I'm being more of a servant. Being a consultant means you are serving others. So I'm being a servant as a security organization, instead of standing there and saying, we need to do this, you cannot do that, which unfortunately a lot of our security leaders still do. You're being consultative. You're asking, how can I help you? What can I learn from you? How can we do this together? And one way to do this is show how security impacts the business in terms that the business leaders can understand these slides. Thank you. Grace under pressure. I appreciate that, Lisa. Third one, personal appeal, 42% commitment, building relationships with decision makers, building trust through demonstrating empathy and understanding for the decisions that need to be made. Having worked with so many executives and having been one myself, I can say that it is exhausting having to be the one that has all the answers all the time. And I've seen leaders who you walk into their offices, and these might be CEOs of companies or VPs that head up organizations of thousands of employees, and you walk into the office and you ask, hey, how are you doing today? How are you feeling? And they just take a big sigh and they go, oh my God, thank you for asking that, because I feel like I have to take care of everyone else. And I don't ever get asked how I am or what's going on in my world or how I'm feeling today. And, I just get the slew of presentation after presentation, meeting after meeting after meeting. Everybody wants something from me. And, the things that I need to do are stacking up. And that's just always the case. So I want to introduce you to a tool called the trust equation. Trust. And this is really specifically to deep dive on that last point, but I think it's super helpful for each one of these three influence tactics. Trust. So what are the sort of building blocks of trust? And, if we think back to high school maths, this is an equation. The things on the top of the equation increase trust, and increasing the things on the bottom of the equation actually decrease trust. So what increases trust? Reliability, credibility, intimacy. What decreases trust? Self-orientation. So we as engineers, we as technologists, we do really well at reliability and credibility. This is where we're strong, right? We are, we deliver on what we say we're going to deliver, and we have the chops to, we stand by what we say because everyone knows that we have the experience, we have the expertise, we're the right people for the role, we are credible experts. What we do poorly is building intimacy, and this is around, hey, treating business leaders, decision makers, our business stakeholders as humans, building intimate relationships. And this is an area where women in cybersecurity and women in infosec are really changing the game, because we're natural relationship builders a lot more than men are. And we have certain skills that we bring to the table. This is not a blanket statement. There are always exceptions to all rules. There are men that are extremely high on the empathy scale, and there are women that are not. But women tend to be, the trends tend to be, much more inclined to the relationship building, which is a huge advantage of women in the space. Self-orientation. So what is self-orientation? Now, self-orientation is not just me. That is absolutely what it is as well. But in this context, and it's not really like arrogance as much as it is what I said before, going back to, putting yourself in the other person's shoes, understanding what universe that they are living in, understanding the business, like the decisions and the trade-offs that they're trying to make, and helping them make it easy for them. I sometimes see presentations where someone brings in a ton of data, and I'm like looking, I've come off another meeting and I'm looking at the slide, and it's so full of data, and I'm trying so hard. My brain is working so hard to try and figure out what is the takeaway from the slide. And if they had just put a little box on the side saying takeaway or insight or something like that to help make it easy for me. You shouldn't be giving your leaders work to do by dumping a ton of data and then making them figure out what the insight is. They're smart, right? And they want to be seen as smart. Everyone wants to be seen as smart, especially if you're a leader in an organization. There's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of political pressure, and you don't want to, there's a lot of leaders that don't want to be seen as vulnerable. So they're less likely to say, hey, I just don't understand what's going on. Or hey, this is just like too much data for me to understand what's going on. Just to make it easy for me, tell me. So self-orientation could just be, not really understanding that you need to help the leader make the decision that they need to make. So that's the trust equation. So this is super important. So as you're going into any conversation with any leader, as you're thinking about your own relationships with the leaders in your organization, where are you on the trust equation? What parts of it are you doing well? What parts of it do you need to increase within the individual in the organization? How do you think about your political capital around the organization? Who do you have relationships with? How much trust do you have in those people? Will they, or do they have in you? Will they inherently trust the data that you're putting in front of them? So these are things that you can really take away and think about and chew on and say, hey, how do I be more strategic? How do we be more tactical in how I approach this? Business impact. So going back to the previous slide, consultation. So we talked about personal appeal in the trust equation, but let's go into consultation. Solve the problem the business cares about. Shows how security impacts the business. So how does security impact the business, or the lack of security? How does the security threat impact the business? So we as technologists love to come in and talk about, threat vectors, and we talk about incidents, and we talk about all these things are really great. But, me as a business leader who has no real concept of any of those things, what does that really mean to me? And how do I translate that into what really makes sense for the business and what really moves the business? So here is a framework that I used to like using at McKinsey that kind of breaks down all the security threat into 5 parts. And here they are on the left-hand side. Number 1, direct financial impact. So I've had a CISO, or a chief financial officer, actually fall victim to a spear phishing organization, transferred $60,000 into someone's account because he got an email from his CEO that was not his CEO telling him to make that transfer. There is direct financial impact. Storytelling. I hope you realize I'm telling stories as well to help color the argument that I'm making. That's another tactic that you can use in executive communication. Direct financial impact, customer impact. Direct customer impact, theft of PII, Equifax, Target, you name it. Operational impact. So one thing I would say about these last four things, these ones don't have direct financial impact, but they have indirect financial impact. So we're counting the dollars on the left-hand side as financial impact, and we're summing it up to the value at stake here. But we're also counting the qualitative impact to the business, and that is the qualitative business impact. So each one of these things have a financial and a qualitative impact. So customer impact has has an indirect financial impact in that you might lose customer business or revenue as a result, and it has, obviously a large amount of qualitative business impact. Operational impact. This is like the Maersk NotPetya incident where they could not do business. This is also Saudi Aramco's incident where they, 40,000 computers were wiped, cannot do business. Has a direct financial impact, of course, because you can't, you won't be able to. Your website might not be up, your revenue streams might be down, the ability to make money is down. But it also has a qualitative business impact, right? What is the long-term effect of the business? What is the long-term sentiment of the business? Regulatory impact. So fines from regulators, absolutely, that has a financial impact. But what is the long-term regulatory impact? After every major breach in an industry, the regulators get a little bit stricter. They start asking more questions. You might impose more fines, might increase for the entire industry. You might have more audit requirements that cost money. So what is the qualitative and non-direct financial impact of a regulatory impact? Finally, reputation impact. And I think that goes without saying. What is the long-term customer sentiment that will go away because of these? A breach of your network that is very public. Do customers totally lose trust in you? Do they choose to go to competitors instead of you? Is it one of those breaches that everyone talks about for years and years and years? Very, very, very important as well. Very qualitative there. So I think that we as engineers, we always try and, really focus on the value at stake. But really, I think it's making this argument, this holistic argument, and showing to a CEO, to a CFO, to a VP of operations, hey, this is how it's going to impact you and your universe and your world if this happens. There's a financial impact that we can estimate, but, it's a range. We can't really be 100%, accurate in terms of estimating the value at stake of, all these four things beneath here, but it is enormous. But what's really enormous is going to be the qualitative business impact. And qualitative arguments do move the needle for business leaders. If you say, hey, I'm going to have, my operations are going to be down for like 3 weeks, that makes tons of sense to them. They can already, understand the level of impact and how that impacts, you don't have to do all the work for them in that space. But you're giving them information in a term that they can understand that really makes sense to them and is meaningful to them and drives them to action. So this is a framework that you can borrow in terms of having these discussions. What do you notice about this? One thing I notice about this is that I haven't said a single thing about threat actors, or maybe threat actors. We can talk about threat actors here. That makes sense to business stakeholders. But we haven't talked about threat vectors. We haven't talked about vulnerabilities. We haven't talked about cybersecurity controls. We haven't talked about any of that stuff. Not that that's not important, but again, speaking Martian to Venetians, they're not going to understand any of that. It's going to go over all of their heads, and it's not going to be meaningful and impactful. So, a couple of tips in communicating with executives and business stakeholders, or really anyone. Number one, make no assumptions. So don't assume that people have any understanding of anything. When I was first starting at McKinsey, I used to say, oh, why are we defining this term? Of course, this business leader will know what this means. And I was told again and again, no, don't make any assumptions. You are an expert in this field. They are not. Have the empathy. And if they, add the definition in, clarify the term, even break it down into simple, colloquial speak, you're not going to be offending anyone unless you're talking to, a specific expert in that space. But business experts are not experts in your field. They're experts in something else. So make no assumptions. Empathy, empathy, empathy. And I put the picture of the shoes in here because, imagine being in that person's shoes. And I don't know if it's surprising for you to see the word empathy mentioned so many times in a cybersecurity talk, but it is so critically important. We as technologists often think that it's technology alone and rational and data that really drives people, but no, humans are humans, they're not robots. So don't speak to a human in the way that you speak to a robot. Empathize. Understand where they're coming from, what their day is like, what decisions that they want to make, what trade-offs that they're trying to make, and make it easy for them. The third one is top-down communication. So here's the bird. He's at the top of this ledge and he's looking down, or she's looking down at the world below. So what does this mean? It means that executives like to hear things in a different order to engineers. So as engineers, we get taught to lead with the data, go do the detailed analysis, present your findings from, here's my introduction, here's how I, what I did, here's my whole process of what I did, here's all the data I discovered, here's the conclusion at the end. Whereas business communication is the opposite way around. You start with the overarching governing thought. So this could be and you start with the conclusion. And then you break it down into its component parts. It's completely a mind flip from what we are used to and how we are used to seeing data if you studied and you have like an academic background in engineering and technology. So we're going to talk about, I'll show you a couple of ways to do this. And if you have questions, please put them down in the chat. I'm happy to take Q&A at the end as well. So I'm going to present to you one communication framework that I like to use, and this can help you in developing storylines to talk to executives or business decision makers. And the one that I really like to use, which I've even used in the document, and we'll look at that in a second, is situation complication resolution. So the first part of the story is, hey, you're setting the scene, you're starting with what is true today, and what that means is, what can we all agree on? Can we set some common ground? Security is a very big deal in the organization, or this organization is trying to acquire, 15,000 new customers this year. This is a fact we all agree on. And it does two things. And one, sets the context in terms of what is the overall problem that we're all trying to solve. What is the overall sort of foundation that we're all here for together. So it kind of creates common ground. And this is a sort of storyline tactic, but it's also an interpersonal tactic. It creates trust and mutual understanding between people that might be completely at odds with each other from the business, technology, cybersecurity, very, very different universes. It creates one level playing field where everyone can play within. Second part of the story is the complication. So this is really where you define the problem and delve deep into why it is so difficult. So what makes this complicated to solve? And this is where you are setting up for the resolution. So presenting answers that don't link to specific problems that you have raised logically makes people think, oh, where's this coming from? So this is where you really say, here are the 5 things that we need to solve, or the 3 things. 3 things is key here. And then you go into your resolution, which is sharing your recommendations that solve the problems listed above, deep dive with data, and analyze alternatives. So this is where you can have your charts and your graphs, but you have to say, this is the resolution, and here's some data to support it, not the other way around. And then ensure you end with next steps to help. And this is, again, empathy, to help you organize whoever your audience is, figure out what's the next step. Where do you want to move? You don't just leave them to figure out for themselves. You're the expert, not them. You have to help them, hold their hand, and just take them along. So I said, start with the answer up front. That's typically, hey, this year we need to spend X amount on the security program, and these are the things that these are the things that we're gonna recommend. Let me take you through this analysis and tell you why. Situation complication resolution. So that's how you'd set up your presentation. And yeah, so that's basically it. From the slides perspective, go make it rain. But I want to just show you a couple of things that I've done in this presentation that you can borrow as well in your presentations that are just common executive storytelling tools and techniques. So the one is, I'll show you how I did, and that's my dog, situation, complication, resolution. So you start with the situation. Everyone can agree on these things. These are common things. So this was the situation. I presented some data that everyone can agree on. Everyone's in the security space, and they can agree on this. Then I went into the complication, the problem, and why it is so chunky. So these slides were around the complication. And then these slides from here were all resolution. So I've actually structured my presentation in this framework of situation, complication, resolution. And if you can see, I've added a lot more data into the resolution part of the presentation and not the other way around. The other thing that I've done is, in a lot of places, is three things on a page. And this page, on this page, there's three things. This page, there's three things. So 3 is a really, really magic number. In any sort of argument, you want to have at least 2 legs. If you think about a pyramid, we talk about communication pyramids. In any pyramid, you have to actually have at least 2 legs. But in communication pyramids, we say maximum 5. The magic number is 3. And why I use 3 is because if I give you 3 things to remember, you'll probably remember all 3 of them. If I give you 5 things to remember, you'll probably remember about 2 of them. If I give you 8 things to remember, you'll probably remember none of them. Empathy. Help people, make it easy for them to understand what you're trying to say and retain the information. Don't make it hard for them. If I give you a list of 8 things, you'll remember on average 0. Crazy stuff. So we talked about situation, resolution, complication. We talked about 3 things. We talked about top-down communication. Top-down meaning, and here's an example of top-down communication. If I can get there. Right, my first slide, I told you exactly by the end of the session you will, and I gave you 3 things. So I set the tone, gave you sort of where we're going so that you can figure out the overarching arc in the sort of sections that I've put together to give you an overview of the entire thing. And then I go into all of the details and then I conclude. So that's an example of top-down communication. So yeah, we talked about the SRC framework. We've talked about 3 things. We talked about top-down communication, and we also talked about using data to support assertions, not the other way around. So these are sort of like 4 top tips for executive communication in driving business outcomes. I love dogs. Fur babies, make it rain. I agree. So I have got a poll up there around how much, there's a poll in the chat, to the right of the chat, how much of your security program asks got funded this past year. Why don't you head along there? And if you have questions, please ask them in the chat now. But if I can get back here. So let me just give it a few minutes for any questions. Was this helpful? Anything coming up for you all? You can follow me on Instagram. My Instagram is below, Rhea Naidoo, with a couple of spaces underneath. Twitter. So those are the best places to find me. I also am a leadership coach that teaches executive communication and leadership skills for sort of technologists. I work mostly with entrepreneurs, CEOs, and their teams, lots of startup founders as well. And I'm also launching a podcast called Enormous Issues, Audacious Ideas, looking at how technology is changing the world and how the world can be changed in a positive or negative way as a result of technology. So it's the apex of world issues, technology, and very importantly, leaders. Who do we need to be as leaders to come up with audacious ideas that change the world? And how do we sort of expand ourselves as leaders so that we can bring sort of more range into our problem solving and into our innovation? Yes, thank you so much for joining and putting up with all the craziness with the presentation and the dog and everything else. I'm so glad that you were able to see my slides in the end. And for all the encouragement in the chat. Could not thank you more. I could not thank you enough. So appreciate that so much. This has been really, really fun. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jalene. Thank you, Bayarma. Thank you, Diana and Nicole and Carolyn, Lisa, of course. Yeah, I really appreciate all of you. Yep. And if you need any more information, if you want to chat, please reach out to me on Instagram or Twitter. I'd be happy to share these slides with you as well if it's helpful, or have a conversation and support you more in whatever you're trying to do in your organization.